There have been a ton of great NBA defenders throughout history. Some of them have won Defensive Player of the Year, others won it multiple times. However, there's always been a ton of great defenders who never won the award. Whether it's because they didn't have the same recognition or popularity, or maybe it's because they got overshadowed by other great defenders in their own generation. In this video, let's take a look at 12 of the greatest defenders who never won a single Defensive Player of the Year award, and I'll try to give an explanation on why these guys did not win it. Also, I won't be including guys like Bill Russell, because when he played, the award was not even invented yet, and I'm sure if it was, he would have won a lot of them. The DPOY was invented in 1982, so we'll go from there. All these guys entered the NBA after that year. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and let's get started. Number 12, Joe Dumars. When you think of tough, gritty defenders who constantly stick to you and bother you all game long, guys like Gary Payton would come to mind. But Joe Dumars was also a guy who fits into that category perfectly. As a 5-time All-Defender, Dumars spent most of his career in Detroit, where him and Isaiah Thomas would form one of the best defensive backcourts in NBA history. The Pistons would always be near the top of the league in defensive rating in every season of Joe Dumars' prime. When Michael Jordan was asked, "Who was the best defensive player you ever played against?" Jordan said, "Joe Dumars. He was the toughest guy for me to drive by." However, in a stacked league in the 1980s and 1990s with tons of other great defenders, Dumars simply did not stand out as much as others, even though his teammates and peers knew how good he was. Number 11, John Stockton. Stockton holds the record for the most total steals in NBA history, a record that will most likely never ever be broken. That in itself should make Stockton deserve a spot on this list. However, unlike other dominant defensive guards, Stockton was great because of his consistency and reliability. Stockton was never a leading candidate to win Defensive Player of the Year in any particular season, because just like with Dumars, there were others in his generation who were simply better than he was. While Dumars finished in the top 5 in DPOY voting in 3 different seasons, Stockton never even cracked top 5 even once. Despite averaging over 3 steals a game for multiple seasons, Stockton's defensive prowess came from his steady consistency, and he was focused on not making any mistakes as opposed to going for the flashy plays. Number 10, Patrick Ewing. Have you ever seen a guy who averaged 4 blocks a game and not even be considered for a DPOY? Have you seen a guy who anchored the number 1 defense in the league for 3 straight seasons, and not even finish top 3 in voting for any season? Well, that's Patrick Ewing for you. He was one of the toughest post defenders ever, and his numbers speak for themselves. I know that blocks and steals are not the only way to measure defense, but even from the eye test, Ewing was phenomenal. The Knicks were also consistently near the top of the league in defensive rating. The problem was, well, he got overshadowed by guys who were even better defenders than he was. I'm talking about Hakeem Olajuwon and David Robinson. They were some all-time great defenders, and Ewing was simply not as good as them. It's kinda sad because I feel like if Ewing played in any other era, he would get way more attention. Number 9, Chris Paul. 9-time All-Defense, 6-time leader in steals per game. One of the highest defensive ratings out of any other point guard in NBA history. Chris Paul unfortunately falls into the same category as Stockton and Joe Dumars. Paul had a few top 5 finishes in the voting, but just like them, they got overshadowed by other dominant defenders of their era. Most of them were big men. For Chris Paul, he was never going to win the award over someone like Dwight Howard. As great of a one-on-one perimeter defender he was, and as great as he was playing the passing lanes and reading the offense, he never had the same impact as Dwight. Also, some people say that Paul was not a versatile defender either, as he was only 6 feet tall and just defended other point guards. But that's not true. Paul spent plenty of time defending bigger players as well, guys like Kobe, and especially Kevin Durant. In the 2014 playoffs, Paul gave Durant a lot of trouble, despite being nearly a foot shorter than him. Of course, his height was a big issue, but he made up for it with his toughness and smarts. Number 8, LeBron James. Now, obviously, as LeBron got older, he's no longer the same defender as before. It happens to many players when they age. He can't give 100% effort on both sides of the floor because he physically cannot. But back in his prime in Cleveland, but mainly in Miami, he was legitimately the best and most versatile defender in the entire league. LeBron has had multiple times when he finished top 10 in DPOY voting. In 2009 and in 2013, LeBron finished second place in the voting for both years. Although the 2009 ballot was strictly dominated by Dwight Howard, he was very close to winning it in 2013. He secured 18 first-place votes, but he would lose to Marc Gasol, who took home the award. That was the closest he's ever gotten to winning it, but he fell short. And I think, for most of us who watched the NBA back in 2013, LeBron probably should have won. But at the same time, Marc Gasol anchored the second-best defense in the entire league, while the Miami Heat was only 9th in defensive rating that year. That definitely had something to do with it. Number 7, Jason Kidd. You know, when you think of the best defensive guards of all time, Jason Kidd doesn't really get mentioned that much. But in my opinion, out of every other point guard in NBA history, Jason Kidd is better defensively than all of them, except for maybe Gary Payton. And his accolades certainly prove it. In his career, Kidd made the All-Defensive team 9 times, including 4 first-team All-Defense. However, despite that incredible feat, he was never even close to winning the award. When Kidd played, there was this general perception that big men or wing players were much more important on defense than guards were. And for the most part, that's true. Big men tend to have a bigger responsibility on defense. That's why guys like Dikembe Mutombo, Alonzo Mourning, Ben Wallace, Dwight Howard, all these guys were winning it throughout Kidd's career. Very few point guards have ever won the award, but Kidd was a big point guard, at a strong 6'4". Even as he got older, he would defend both guard positions, sometimes small forwards too, and he did it pretty well. But he just never got the recognition. Number 6, Kobe Bryant. Say what you want about Kobe's later years, because I know many fans think that his last couple of All-Defense nominations were uncalled for. I think there's some truth to that, as just like LeBron as he got older, Kobe also did not give 100% effort on defense by his early 30s. With that being said, he still has a whopping 12 all-defensive selections with no DPOY. In Kobe's early days, this was when he probably had the best chance to win it. He was a defensive stopper and always took on the task of guarding the opponent's best perimeter player. He finished in the top 5 in DPOY voting a couple of times, but for the most part, he was never a real contender to win the award. It was because, well, there were other players who were better defenders in his era. He also did not record a ton of steals like other guards of his era like Allen Iverson or Jason Kidd, and back then, many voters looked at steals and used it as a way to determine a player's defensive value. It wasn't the best way to do it, but that's how it usually went. And Kobe only averaged more than 2 steals a game in one season of his 20 years in the NBA. It's not a knock on Kobe, but I think most of us would agree that he was never the best defender in the league in any particular year. Number 5, Tony Allen. Although Tony Allen finished his career with only 6 all-defensive selections, his peak performances on defense was a spectacle to watch. Despite being listed at only 6'4", he was a strong guy and could guard everyone from point guard to even smaller power forwards. Recently, Kobe was asked who was the toughest defender he ever played against. He responded with, "That's easy, Tony Allen. He was the only one not crying for help." Meaning that whenever Tony Allen played defense, he rarely ever called for a double team. Unfortunately, when it came to DPOY, he only cracked the top 4 in voting for one season. That was in 2011, around the same time that Dwight Howard was on a roll. Also, as great as Allen was, the Grizzlies' team defense was so good that even with him injured, they were still a top 5 defensive team. Plus, they had Marc Gasol taking some of the votes too. Still, when it came to perimeter defense, Tony Allen was the guy that nobody wanted to play against. He didn't have a huge role on offense, so he would always give 110% effort on defense and try to shut you down. Number 4, Bruce Bowen. Bowen spent many years in San Antonio where, along with Tim Duncan, they would turn the Spurs into a defensive powerhouse. but he also spent many years coming in second place in DPOY to Ben Wallace. When you think of the 2000s era of basketball and you think of the best, grittiest defenders in that time, Bruce Bowen should immediately come to your mind. He would guard all the greatest players of that era, from Kobe Bryant to Tracy McGrady, Vince Carter, and even Dirk Nowitzki. Although there were times when people would say, man, Bruce was a dirty player. And that was kinda true. He had a ton of moments where he would step under a shooter's foot. It was a really egregious move when he did it. In fact, he was one of the guys who changed the NBA rules. The league made it necessary to protect their shooters and give them space to land. You wonder, nowadays we see a lot more fouls on three-point shots, and Bruce had a lot to do with this. So, was he a dirty player? Sometimes, but even so, he was still a phenomenal defender. The best perimeter defender of his era. Number 3, Andrei Kirilenko. If you've ever seen Kirilenko play, he was like Draymond Green but recorded more steals and more blocks. The dude was a freak, a ridiculously good defender. Kirilenko was 6'9" with a 7'4" wingspan, and his long arms helped him get a ton of deflections, loose balls, blocks, steals. His length was crazy. On top of that, he was also very quick and could switch onto point guards in a pinch. He had multiple seasons of averaging over a steal and over 3 blocks a game. In the 2006 season, he would finish 3rd in the league in DPOY voting, as he had the quickness and height to guard every single superstar from Jason Kidd to Kevin Garnett. Unfortunately, Kirilenko's peak was rather short. Overall, I think he's one of the most underrated defenders of all time, cause most of these guys on the list, you already know about them. But Kirilenko, man, nobody talks about him anymore. Number 2, Scottie Pippen. Now, this one might shock you. How many people realize that Scottie Pippen has never won a Defensive Player of the Year award? I mean, when you think of the best defenders of the 1990s, or just the best defenders in NBA history, Scottie Pippen might be a top 5 defender of all time. And yet, he was not able to win the award a single time. He made a total of 10 all-defensive teams, and 8 of them were first-team all-defense. How in the world did Scottie not win DPOY? Well, it's cause he played with a lot of great defenders in his era. Was he a better defender than Hakeem Olajuwon, Dennis Rodman, or David Robinson? Was he a better defender than Michael Jordan, who won the award as well? Maybe. I mean, it's a toss-up between Scottie and Mike, but for the most part, Scottie was not as impactful as the other big men of the 90s. Plus, it's arguable that 2 other players on his own team, Jordan and Rodman, were even better defenders than he was. I mean, that's pretty crazy when you think about it. It's still surprising though that he never won. If you thought Pippen not winning it was a surprise, then let me tell you something. Number 1 on this list is Tim Duncan. 15 times he was selected to the all-defensive teams, the most times in NBA history by a single player. Unlike most other players, Duncan was still a phenomenal defender even when he was an old man. When he entered the league in 1997 until he retired in 2016, he was always a great defender. Duncan anchored the Spurs defense for 2 decades. And you know what? He was a big man too. He played power forward or center for his entire career. So unlike all the guards or forwards on this list who did not make it, how in the hell did Tim Duncan, a big man, not make it? Well, to be fair, the competition was very tough. In the 2000s, Ben Wallace was winning the award over him, which, I mean, it's a toss-up. Duncan would regularly finish in the top 5 or top 3 in the voting, but Ben would always pull ahead. There were a couple years like in 2004 when Ron Artest won the award, but the Pacers had a crazy good defense that year, so it's not a huge deal. Artest definitely deserved it. But then in 2007, maybe Duncan should have won it over Marcus Camby. Now, don't get me wrong, Camby was great, but I feel like the voters just voted for him because he led the league in blocks. The Nuggets were not even a top 10 defensive team that year, while the Spurs had the second best defensive rating. Then, in the later 2000s, Dwight Howard started to win the award, and he was a much bigger game changer and flashier defender than Duncan. He pretty much single-handedly carried the Magic to the top defense in the league for multiple years. It also doesn't help that, for most of Duncan's career, the votes were always being split between him and Bruce Bowen. For those reasons, that's why Duncan never won the award. And in my opinion, he's the biggest snub for DPOY in NBA history. And that's all folks, those were the 10 greatest defenders who never won a single Defensive Player of the Year, ever since the award was invented. Let me know your thoughts on the video, do you think somebody else should be on this list? Let me know in the comments. Thank you everyone so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.